Mad Scientist Barbecue's The Solution Backyard Offset Smoker has had a lot of mystery surrounding its release. It was revealed in January of this year, but ever since then, there wasn't a whole lot of information out there on this smoker. But then we slowly started to see them in action on social media. Jeremy Yoder, Mad Scientist Barbecue himself, started to showcase it on his channels, and they were popping up on Instagram and YouTube posts here and there. And these were just the early stage prototype solution offsets that were being tested. And as some of you may have seen, one of these prototypes went to me. For one single rib cook anyways. So what I have here today is the final production model of the Solution Offset Smoker. And everything I'm going to show you is what's going to show up in customers' delivery trucks right now. And I have learned a lot about this smoker over the last month of testing it. There are some surprising things about it. Some features that I think backyard cooks are really going to like. But there's also some genuine concerns that I have. So grab your notepads, all right? Because there is a lot of information in this video. Subscribe, and let's take a look at the Solution Offset Smoker. So first up, let's talk specs, because I know that's what the majority of people are curious about. Now, there have been some changes from the prototype that I used a while back, including some tweaks to the final dimensions, and we will get into that. So first, the basics. So the Solution Offset Smoker currently costs $2,500. And I'm saying currently because I know that Jeremy is working on another option for those who want to build the smoker themselves at a much lower price, but until that's available, let's see how this smoker stacks up at that $2,500 price point. Here's how it compares to smokers in its size and price category. So the Solution Offset Smoker sits right in the middle tier of backyard smokers. It's not as pricey as some of the super high-end models, but also not as cheap as the smaller, budget-friendly options. At $2,500, it's $700 cheaper than the Workhorse Pit, and $300 more than the Blue Smoke. So do the features of the Solution Offset justify that extra $300 in price difference? Well, we'll get to that conclusion as we go through all the minute details of the smoker right now. The Solution stands 78 inches tall and stretches 86 inches from the stack to the end of the firebox. The cook chamber is 24 inches wide and 40 inches long. It's a sizable cooker. Definitely big, but not the biggest. And it's very important to consider the size if you have a smaller backyard. Mad Scientist Barbecue says that this smoker can handle up to 4 briskets, and from my testing, I can vouch for that claim. I fit 2 briskets, 2 pork butts, a rack of spare ribs, and a 7-bone ribeye roast, all at the same time. So 4 briskets, in my opinion, is a pretty modest estimate. And like I said before, there are some changes from the prototype to the final model. The stack is now bigger at 5.5 inches thick compared to 5 inches on the prototype, giving the final model better airflow. The cook chamber and firebox are also slightly larger, and the door now has a lip to reduce leaks. On the downside, there are a few cosmetic changes, like a new handle design and different hinges. These were made to keep the price at $2,500 for customers, and I think that's pretty impressive given the cost of materials and construction. As we make our way down to the bottom of the smoker, we see my favorite feature of this pit. So as you can see, the legs are bowed out. The pit kind of sits like a bulldog, and this was done intentionally so that you can easily fit and maneuver a 5-gallon bucket under the pit to catch grease. This is such a simple design, but it's probably my favorite feature of this pit. I wish every backyard smoker had this feature. The firebox is 24 inches wide, which is ideal for a backyard pit because it's just wide enough to prop your splits of firewood over the coals without needing base logs, but also wide enough so you can stack your firewood without needing to angle it awkwardly. The way the firebox takes in oxygen is by the door. So if you want to get more oxygen to your fire, then you open the door more, and if you want less, then you close the door more. It also has notches on the door to make sure you have the exact amount of airflow you're looking for every time you cook. It also prevents the wind and the draw of the air into the firebox from unintentionally closing the door. I love this feature, but on the pit I have, the notches were cut a little too narrow, so the handle doesn't completely fit in the notch. It still does the job and keeps the door open, but it still is kind of annoying. The smokestack, as I said earlier, is wider than its prototype predecessor, which makes a difference in how well the pit draws and pulls. But don't worry, we'll talk more about that in just a little bit when we cover my experience actually cooking on this pit. It has a damper that you can open and close by reaching up and pushing the lip of the damper. Personally, I prefer having some kind of system where I can move the damper without having to actually reach up to the stack. And for shorter users, this will be a pretty annoying problem for you. I'm just playing. Also, another pet peeve I have about the damper is it sits perfectly flush with the smokestack. And since I keep my solution offset outside in the elements, when it rains, water leaks into the smokestack and into the smoke collector. With the predecessor and also other pits I have, the damper has a slightly bigger circumference than the smokestack, which keeps the stack dry. On the cook chamber near the bottom of the door is the Tell True thermometer. I really love the thermometer placement on this pit because it reads the temperature at grate level, where you're cooking the meat. This is awesome because it gives a more accurate reading of the cooking temperature compared to other smokers. The cooking grates are super flat, which means they sit lower in the cook chamber. This helps keep your food from getting blasted with hot air on the side facing the fire. And I'm excited to show you guys how much this feature actually affects the cooking when I do the biscuit test. But before we get to the biscuit test, let's talk about the main special feature of the smoker, the scoop baffle. So this movable baffle plate is designed to be pushed right up against the firebox opening for most effective use. The baffle plate directs the smoke from the firebox to the top of the cook chamber, cooking from the top down. It also has holes to let some of the heat through to the bottom, preventing cold spots on the cooking grate. In theory, this is a great design, but the best way to actually test it is to run a biscuit test. I ran the solution at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, damper set to 50%, and the door closed to the second notch. And I put 24 biscuits on the pit and cooked them until they started to really get a lot of color. And based on the color, here's what I learned. Obviously, the biscuits closest to the fire had the most color, especially on the edge facing the fire. But honestly, the hot spot seems to be much less severe than I expected. Based on this biscuit test, if you use the entire cooking grate, outside of the first 4 inches near the firebox, your food should come out perfectly. The biscuits that were closest to the smokestack were also noticeably a bit darker than the rest of the biscuits. Well, outside of that row closest to the firebox, of course, which indicates a bit of a hot spot on the edge closest to the smoke collector and smokestack as well. If you look at the bottoms of all the biscuits of each row, you'll see that first of all, I have been cooking a lot on the smoker and I really need to clean it. But also there's no doughy bottoms. And the brownness on the top of each of the biscuits is the same as the bottom. So with the damper at 50%, this smoker cooks really evenly from the top to the bottom with no indications of dead spots. And overall, just looking at the biscuits as a whole, the pit seems to cook fairly evenly across the entire cook chamber. This was confirmed by an earlier test I ran where I used a ThermalWorks temperature probe to measure the ambient temperature across the grates. And it was pretty spot on with the temperature gauge on the pit. So everyone loves the biscuit test, right? It's great. Every time you get a pit, you gotta do a biscuit test. But what is it actually like cooking on this smoker? So I've done several cooks on this smoker, and here's what I learned. So this pit truly runs differently than other smokers I've used. It's different than the Goldie's pit I have. I will wash and season this smoker, I promise. It's also different than my 250-gallon offset, or the dozens of 1,000-gallon smokers I've seen at various barbecue joints that I've traveled to. And what makes it different is it runs truly like a backyard pit. So the cook chamber is pretty small at 40 inches, so you gotta be really on top of your fire management. The first time I cooked a brisket on this smoker, I finished it in 7 hours because I was just cooking too hot. The brisket actually came out really good. Excellent fat render, great bark color, but the bottom flat under the point was tough because of the extremely short cook. In the bigger pits I mentioned earlier, you can be a little looser with the fire management, since you can just push your food all the way to the smokestack and then add a blocking log and you're pretty much good to go. So with the solution, there is a little bit more of a learning curve in comparison to something like a Goldie's backyard offset. For the damper, I found the sweet spot was about 50% open. Like I said, this pit has a good draw and pull, which basically means that the fire burns really well and the smoke travels quickly over the food out of the stack. So if you open the damper to 100%, you will burn fuel like crazy and it would take forever to cook your food with all that fast air zooming past. With the damper set to 50%, you're able to retain more heat and smoke to cook a little hotter, but still have enough pull to render the fat beautifully. As you can see in my last brisket cook, I mean, absolutely killed this cook. Fat was rendered so nicely. The point was tender but not mushy, and the flat was so tender. Just look how it jiggles on the cutting board. With all of the pros and cons I explained about the solution offset smoker, I think it's an incredible value at $2,500. The pit is absolutely gorgeous. It's a real statement piece for any backyard setup, and with its modest footprint, can also fit most backyard settings. And most importantly, you can cook incredible barbecue on it. So if you're interested, I'll have links and info in the description below on how to order one. And if you want to know more about the mind behind the solution offset, watch the next video on your screen where I cooked briskets with Mad Scientist Barbecue and learned his secret for cooking the perfect brisket. And I'll see you guys over there.